The Backrooms Inescapable. Prologue. People always talked about the Backrooms as an internet myth, a strange place you could, no clip, into if reality glitched out for a moment. But no one truly believed it. It was just a creepypasta, a joke. That's what Chris thought until the day he was standing in his office, reached for his coffee mug, and fell through the floor. Chapter 1. A Step into Madness. Chris hit the ground hard. His office, his coworkers, everything was gone. He was lying on old, grimy carpet, and the smell of mildew filled his nostrils. Dazed, he got to his feet. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, casting a dull yellow glow over the endless expanse of rooms. The wallpaper was peeling, a nauseating shade of beige, and there was no sound. Nothing. He called out, "Hello." His voice echoed strangely, but there was no reply. Panic began to rise in his chest. The room stretched on, empty, identical, and wrong. Each corner he turned led to more hallways, more endless rooms. The sheer size of the place was impossible, and yet there he was, trapped. Chapter 2. The Silent Watchers. Hours passed, or was it days? Chris couldn't tell anymore. His phone was useless, no signal, no internet. He tried the doors he found, but they didn't open. They were just there, fake and sealed shut. As he wandered deeper, something else started to bother him. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But it wasn't. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision. Just as he was about to turn a corner, he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the lights, watching him. But when he whipped around to look, there was no one there. The silence became oppressive, almost deafening, and the lights began to buzz. Chapter 3. Hallucinations. Chris's mind started to unravel. The more he walked, the more the rooms seemed to shift. Walls appeared where they hadn't been before. Corridors stretched longer or got narrower, forcing him to squeeze through tight gaps. He tried marking his way, scratching the wallpaper with his keys, but it didn't matter. Whenever he came back, the marks were gone, as though the backrooms didn't want him to leave. And then came the voices. They were faint at first, like distant whispers, just beyond his understanding. But as he moved deeper into the labyrinth, they grew louder. They spoke gibberish, broken sentences, and sometimes they sounded like his own voice, mocking him. Chapter 4. Deeper into the maze. He found stairs, spiraling downward. The moment his foot touched the first step, he knew he shouldn't go down. But the walls above him began to close in, like the backrooms were pushing him, forcing him to descend. The lower he went, the colder it became. The walls were different here, damp, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Every step echoed endlessly, as though the place was hollow beneath him. The voices in his head grew louder. Chapter 5. The Mirrors. At the bottom of the stairs, Chris found a room that was different from the others. Its walls were lined with mirrors, tall, cracked, and warped. When he looked into them, his reflection was wrong. His face twisted in unnatural ways, smiling when he wasn't. He blinked, and the reflection didn't blink back. Suddenly, one of the reflections stepped out of the mirror. It was him, but distorted, grinning maniacally, eyes wide with madness. Chris stumbled backward, but the reflection followed him, matching his every move until it cornered him against the wall. Just as the reflection raised its hand, it shattered into dust, leaving Chris gasping for breath. But the mirrors remained, and now they showed more than just his face. They showed other people, trapped, terrified, banging on the glass from the inside. Chapter 6. The Hunger. Chris didn't know how long he'd been in the backrooms. His body was weakening. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and thirst burned his throat. There was no food, no water, no way to sustain himself. His legs ached from walking endlessly through this twisted maze. He found a table in one of the rooms, with a plate of food on it. But the food was wrong, too vibrant, too perfect. The fruit was overly ripe, the bread unnaturally warm. Something told him not to eat, but his hunger overpowered him. As soon as he took a bite, his vision blurred, and the room shifted around him. The walls began to pulse like they were alive, breathing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The taste turned sour, and the food melted into black ooze in his mouth. He vomited and ran, but the feeling of something crawling under his skin stayed. Chapter 7. The Entity. He wasn't alone. Something else was here with him. He could hear its footsteps now, slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the chase. The air around him grew heavier, colder. As he turned a corner, he saw it for the first time, a tall, faceless figure. Its body was long and gaunt, its movements unnaturally smooth. It had no eyes, but Chris could feel its gaze on him. It didn't move quickly, it didn't have to. It knew Chris had nowhere to run. Chapter 8, The Glitches. As he fled from the entity, the backrooms began to glitch. Walls flickered and shifted, rooms looped back on themselves. Sometimes, when he ran down a hallway, he found himself running right back into the same room. His reflection appeared in places it shouldn't have, on the walls, the floors, even in the air around him. At one point, he ran straight through a wall, like it wasn't there, only to fall into another level of the backrooms, a basement-like level, filled with water up to his knees. The fluorescent lights above flickered dimly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the water's surface. Chapter 9, The Sounds from Below. In the flooded level, the silence was broken by strange, distant sounds, a low humming, mechanical whirring, and faint whispers. Chris could hear splashes in the water, but when he looked, nothing was there. The cold, murky water lapped at his legs, and the fear of what might be lurking just below the surface made his skin crawl. He waded forward, careful not to make too much noise. But the sounds persisted, splashing, scraping, as though something was beneath him, watching, waiting. His heart raced as he realized he wasn't alone in the water. Chapter 10, The Shadow Beings. From the corners of his vision, Chris started seeing shadowy figures. They weren't fully formed, more like silhouettes, watching him from the distance. At first, they seemed far away, but as he blinked, they moved closer, their movements subtle but deliberate. The worst part was that they didn't seem to follow the rules of the backrooms. They flickered in and out of existence, appearing closer every time he turned a corner, as though they were warping reality itself to get to him. He tried running, but the figures were relentless. Every time he thought he'd lost them, they were right there, closer than before. And now, they whispered his name. Chapter 11, The Shift. Chris's sense of time was completely shattered. He couldn't tell how long he had been there, days, weeks, years. His mind was unraveling, and the walls seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, like the backrooms were alive. He began to question whether the things he saw were real. Had there ever been an exit? Was this place endless? Then, he felt it, a subtle shift in reality. The backrooms seemed to fold in on themselves. The walls stretched, and the rooms began to tilt. Gravity changed, pulling him sideways, making it hard to stand. The very floor beneath him rippled like water. Chapter 12, The Trap. The deeper he went, the more the backrooms toyed with him. There were doors now, but they were always locked. He could hear sounds, voices, coming from behind them, muffled but human. People trapped inside. Desperation clawed at him. He found an open door and ran through, only to realize the door had led him right back to the same room he'd started in. It was a trap, a never-ending loop. No matter how hard he tried to escape, he was always brought back to the same place. Chapter 13, The Infinite Corridor. After what felt like an eternity, Chris stumbled upon a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were narrower here, almost suffocating. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. As he began walking down the corridor, he noticed something chilling. No matter how far he went, the corridor never seemed to end. It felt like he was walking in place, the scenery repeating itself over and over. The air grew thicker, and the oppressive silence was only broken by the faint sound of footsteps echoing behind him, his own footsteps. Or were they? Suddenly, the footsteps multiplied, coming from all directions, growing louder. Chris stopped, but the footsteps didn't. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned around, expecting to see someone, or something, but there was only the empty hallway behind him. But then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It looked like him, but its eyes were black, hollow, and filled with malice. It grinned at him, an impossible, twisted grin, and began walking toward him, matching his pace with every step. Chris ran, but the corridor stretched on forever, and now, there were many of them, multiple versions of himself, emerging from the shadows, each one grinning more twistedly than the last. Chapter 14, The False Exit. Just when Chris thought he could take no more, he saw it, a door at the end of the corridor. An exit. The sight of it filled him with hope. He sprinted toward it, hearing the false versions of himself behind him, laughing maniacally. The door seemed to flicker, like a mirage, but Chris didn't care. He had to get out. He threw himself at the door, turning the handle and bursting through it. Sunlight. He was outside, back in the real world. He could see the sky, feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. The sounds of the city surrounded him, cars, people, life. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, laughing in disbelief. He had escaped. He was free. But then, something felt wrong. The sun was too bright, almost blinding. The air was too still. And the people walking by, they moved in strange, jerky motions, like broken marionettes. Their faces were blank, emotionless. One of them stopped and stared directly at Chris, eyes empty, before slowly morphing into his own face. Suddenly, the world around him melted. The sky turned black, the ground crumbled beneath him, and the sounds warped into a cacophony of distorted screams. The exit was a lie. He was still inside the backrooms, and now it was toying with his perception of reality. The door slammed shut behind him, disappearing into the walls, trapping him deeper than before. Chapter 15. The Entity Returns. As the illusion of the false exit faded, Chris was plunged into the darkest part of the backrooms yet. The walls were alive, pulsating like veins filled with black ichor. The floors were sticky, and the smell of rot hung heavy in the air. The light barely flickered here, casting eerie shadows that seemed to crawl along the ground. And then he heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they weren't just behind him. They were all around him. The entity that had been stalking him was back, and now it was closer than ever. The air grew colder, and Chris could feel its presence, breathing down his neck. He turned to face it, but before he could react, it stepped out of the darkness, towering over him. The faceless, gaunt figure had changed. It was more human-like now, with tattered clothes hanging from its skeletal frame. Its mouth opened into a wide, toothless grin, and from its throat came a sound, a horrible, low hum that vibrated through Chris's bones. The creature reached out, its long fingers brushing against Chris's skin. Every touch felt like ice, draining the warmth from his body. As it leaned closer, its breath cold and foul, it whispered something unintelligible in his ear, a word that sent shivers down his spine. And then, it spoke clearly for the first time. You were never meant to leave. Chris tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The entity gripped him tighter, pulling him closer, and as it did, the backrooms itself seemed to close in. The walls rippled, shifting like liquid, forming into grotesque faces that laughed at his terror. Chapter 16. The Endless Fall. Chris was dragged through the backrooms, his body weightless as if he were falling, though there was no ground beneath him. He tumbled through corridors, through spaces that shouldn't exist, the rooms warping and shifting around him like a twisted kaleidoscope. As he fell, he saw glimpses of others trapped like him, people screaming, crying, lost in their own endless loops, their minds fractured beyond repair. Some were running from creatures too horrifying to comprehend, while others sat in dark corners, rocking back and forth, their eyes wide with terror. And then he realized the truth: there was no escape. The backrooms were alive, feeding off fear, warping reality to trap those unlucky enough to fall through. It wasn't just a dimension, it was a living, breathing entity that craved suffering. Chris's fall slowed, and he found himself floating in a vast, empty void, surrounded by endless rooms stretching into infinity. The voices of the trapped souls echoed around him, whispers of those who had come before, their minds shattered by the endless maze. In the distance, he saw something horrifying. It was himself, running endlessly through the backrooms, forever chased by his own reflections, his face twisted into a mask of fear and despair. The entity whispered once more in his ear, its voice cold and final, "This is where you belong." And with that, the walls of the backrooms closed in, trapping Chris in an eternal loop, forever falling, forever running, forever lost. Epilogue. No one ever knew what happened to Chris. He was just another missing person, lost in the mundane world. But deep within the backrooms, his screams joined the countless others, trapped, forgotten, and broken by the maze that would never let him go.